I think when I was a kid, anything that would give me any sort of excitement or amusement or enjoyment, it always got kind of fucked. Maybe if I could provide more amusement or enjoyment for myself, it would be easier to provide for others. I have to remind myself to breathe sometimes. I have to remind myself to be present.
I still remember the first time that I watched The Bear. It was the summer of 2022 when it dropped quietly on FX, barely any hype, just strong reviews and a great word of mouth. At that time, it felt like one of those shows that people respected but hadn't fully caught up with yet. But I remember that moment so vividly because how it made me feel. I don't think I had that much raw excitement watching an episode of television in such a long time. What I thought I was getting into was a pretty straightforward story, a chaotic group of people coming together to rebuild a struggling restaurant in downtown Chicago. I could not have been more wrong. Because The Bear doesn't just entertain you, it gets under your skin. It's so stressful and messy and so deeply human. I couldn't have been more wrong when I thought I was just starting a show about a generic group of friends who remodeled a downtrodden Chicago restaurant. But you know what? I've never been more surprised by just how wrong I was. The Bear, for people who don't know, is basically a show about a found family. It follows Kami, played by Jeremy Allen White, as he tries to run his brother's struggling restaurant in Chicago. And the various challenges he faces, especially from the people working with him, form the basic premise of the story. Now, on paper, this is a pretty simple concept. It's not some high concept show that needs deep breakdowns or complex explanations, but the way that it's told completely catches you off guard. The editing, especially in the earlier seasons, I have to admit, is so incredibly intense and profound in a way that you really can't look away from it. Every episode feels like a small anxiety attack packed within those 20 to 30 minutes of runtime. I think part of the reason is also because you're constantly reminded that despite how hard these characters are trying to save their livelihoods and keep this business up and running, everything they've built can fall apart in just seconds. And I think that tension, that constant pressure, and that sense of urgency and desperation is exactly where the show originally thrived. And I think it's also fair to say that while The Bear took a bit of time to find its footing, once it did, there was a pretty sudden shift in how people talked about it. It quickly moved from being a relatively quiet show to something with a genuinely cult following. And while I think there's always a risk with great shows getting pulled into this kind of hype circle, I can't deny it was also exciting to see something I liked so much being so widely appreciated. But as with all good things that eventually come to an end, it's no longer 2022 and The Bear is just no longer an underdog story. It's 2026 and the show is reportedly heading into what might be its final season. And honestly, while there's a part of me that feels a bit sad about saying goodbye to it, it also feels like the right time. Because The Bear isn't an underdog story anymore, and as much as the underdog energy, the chaos, the rooting for the broken characters trying to fix their lives is exciting, it doesn't last forever. Once the underdogs have had their moment in the spotlight, that sense of excitement and urgency, that feeling of watching something fragile trying to just survive, it starts to wear off. And what really makes me sad is the way the general conversation around The Bear has shifted. A lot of people feel like it lost its momentum after a certain point. Some people say season 2 was the peak, other people say that season 3 or 4 is where it started to really fall off. But to me, the answer has always been very simple. The Bear only worked as long as it told an underdog story. And I think the major contradiction with telling any underdog story is that eventually the underdog stops being the underdog. At some point, the struggling down on the luck characters finally become successful. They win, they achieve what they were chasing all along. And that's usually where the story naturally ends. Because that's a satisfying conclusion, the journey pays off, the character completes their arcs, and the audience gets closure. But The Bear didn't really end there. And to make up for the lack of coherent central narrative, the show started going into this overdrive, filling every episode with as many characters and subplots as humanly possible. But in doing that, it ends up giving none of these characters enough breathing room to actually develop beyond what feels like just a mere functional plot device. And this really brings me to one of my main problems with the show now. First and foremost, it feels so overloaded with characters and overlapping storylines that it no longer resembles the same show that I watched a few years ago. And while I do think it's commendable that it tries to juggle so many different perspectives, at some point I think it becomes a little too much. Those overlapping storylines start to blur together, and instead of adding depth to the overall story, they begin to feel like background noise. And eventually, you stop fully engaging with them. Like, I still care about the main character, but everything happening around him, the constant side stories, the emotional detours, the shifting focus, it starts to feel more exhausting rather than engaging. Instead of adding to the overall story, it just starts to weigh it down. And I think what ties all of this together is very simple. The show just doesn't feel under pressure anymore. In the earlier seasons, everything felt like it was barely holding together. The financial stress, the chaotic service, the constant conflict in the kitchen, that pressure wasn't just part of the story, that was the main story. But now, even when the show deals with emotional themes, it doesn't carry the same urgency, because when everything is explored at once, every character, every trauma, every backstory, it stops feeling sharp. It becomes diffuse, and slowly the edge disappears. And that's really precisely what I think changed for The Bear. It never lost its quality, it just lost its pressure. It became more polished, it became more thoughtful, it became more expansive. But in the process, it lost the chaos that really made it feel alive in the first place. And maybe that's just what happens when an underdog story comes full circle. And I think what's interesting to note here is also that this isn't just a problem specific to The Bear itself, it kind of reflects on a much larger shift in modern day television. A lot of streaming era shows go through the same cycle. They start off very focused and story driven, there's a clear sense of direction, even if the story itself is small in scale. But as soon as the show gains critical success or some cultural momentum, the instinct becomes to expand it rather than contain it. More characters get introduced, more subplots are layered in, more emotional arcs are added to deep in the world. But depth doesn't always come from addition, sometimes it comes from restraint. And The Bear in its early seasons understood that so perfectly well. It didn't need to constantly explain itself, it didn't need to keep widening its scope. It thrived in small claustrophobic spaces, the kitchen, the chaos of service, the emotional volatility between people who were forced to work together, whether they liked it or not. I think that's what made it feel so alive. Now, with this expansion of its world, it feels like the show is trying to justify its own existence through scale, as if the only way forward is to just keep building instead of digging deeper into what already works. And I don't think that's a failure of creativity as much as it is a structural issue with how modern shows are made. When success is measured in renewals and seasons and engagement metrics, there's very little incentive to end things at their natural peak. Everything is encouraged to stretch, evolve, and continue even when the story might already be complete in spirit. Which brings me back to why the earlier version of The Bear felt so powerful. It wasn't trying to be permanent, it felt temporary, fragile, like it could collapse at any moment, both in the story and in its own structure. And that dilemma and that confusion gave it so much more weight. Now, as the show moves closer to its final season, there's a strange irony in how things have come full circle. The show that once thrived on instability is now in a position where stability is expected of it, where it has to maintain consistency rather than chaos. And maybe that's why it feels so different now. Not worse, not better, just different in a way that really makes you aware of time passing, both for the characters and for the show itself. Because in the end, The Bear was never really about running a restaurant. It was about trying to hold something together long enough for it to mean something. And eventually, everything either holds together still or it all collapses to the ground. So yeah, that's it from my side. I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you've seen the show, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you haven't, go watch it and form your own opinions. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel in the longer run. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.